So thank you to everyone who's joined. This is the first in our Eyes Wide Open series that the AQR runs when we feel that there are specific issues that need to be addressed in the industry. So none other than probably the most important one that we all need to address and understand and get to grips with a bit better are issues around diversity and inclusion. So we have 4 webinars coming up. This is the first of which, where we try to look at great case studies of where it's worked well and why it's important that we get it right, frankly. And I think that that's going to be the focus of our next 3 webinars, and is definitely the focus of today's. The other thing to note about our webinars is that we are getting the experts to interview each other in a chain reaction style webinars. Today we have Louisa, who is interviewing Asad, and then next week it won't be Louisa, it'll be actually her colleague from Unilever called Gotche as well, and that will continue. So we are having the experts interview the experts. But that is literally all from me. I will hand over to our 2 experts. You can start by introducing yourselves and start the webinar.
Hello everyone, thank you for being here. It's a pleasure. So I'm Louisa Olafuyi. I'm an innovation specialist over at Unilever, and yeah, very excited for this conversation that we're having today on a very important and timely topic.
And I'm Asad. I'm the founder and CEO of a consultancy called the Unmistakables. We work on creating organisations that are inclusive from the inside out. And so, yeah, looking forward to talk about why diverse audiences might not necessarily exist, even though they're on probably everyone's briefs at the moment of how do we address and to diverse, in inverted commas, audiences.
So, Asad, this actual opportunity has been a wonderful way to really deep dive into the work that you've been doing, and it's such a pleasure to be speaking with you today. So you've been running the award-winning consultancy, the Unmistakables, for about 3 years now, am I right?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, and your business has grown in terms of brands and the companies that you've been working with, and those that need to approach and address inclusion and diversity, or the lack thereof. And I'm really interested to know, what was the spark or series of things that inspired you to do this and to start the Unmistakables?
So I think like, I'm obsessed by economics, and so people talk about balances and counterbalances, and I always think life is just a series of balances and counterbalances. Like if you apply it to lockdown, I think that the counterbalance last year was everyone saying working from home would be the best thing ever. And then the counterbalance this year is everyone saying, actually, I think I'm ready to go back and have some human interaction again. And I think for me, the balances that I was contending with was a feeling of frustration and determination. And that was being driven by 2 things. It was my lived experience and my professional experience. So if I start with my professional experience, because that's where you're meant to start talks like this in a professional context. So I was working my way through agency land with a stint in-house, and I'd made it to my first board level position. And it dawned on me that I was the only person who looked the way I did. I was the only person with brown skin. I was the only Indian man. I would say Indian man. I'm born in Britain, but have Indian heritage. And I realized that there were just certain cues and things that were happening around the table that I wasn't quite getting. And I remember for the first 5 to maybe 10 minutes of the meeting feeling a little bit excluded from that room. And I think that was then doubled by not seeing other people like me and thinking, well, maybe this is not somewhere I'm meant to be. And I came out a few years before that, and I was also the only gay man around the room. So there was just a couple of things playing out. And the word intersectionality at that point hadn't reached the heady heights that it has today. So I was just kind of muddling through that. And then two other things happened. One was I became the comms director for Pride in London as a volunteer. So Pride in London, 3rd biggest one-day event, if events can ever happen again in London, biggest collection of LGBT people in the country. And as a volunteer, I was seeing at a board level within LGBT context, what it felt like to belong in that space, but also what brands and organizations were trying to grapple with in terms of their interaction at Pride, and what it is that they were doing. And that spilled over into my professional world, where I had clients coming to me saying, well, how do we understand different audiences? How do we understand the LGBT community in its entirety? How do we understand the South Asian community, or BAME communities as the rapper works? And I've got views on that we can talk about in a bit. So I kind of saw all of that, and it was an amalgamation to think, well, perhaps I could do something about this. And the frustration of thinking, well, I'm in a large organization at the moment and that has lots of other priorities. I want to use that frustration to create something new, but also feeling determined that there must be a better way. There must be a way to help people in large organizations, small organizations of all types, actually, understand what it is around diversity and inclusion and how they should address that within their organization. So I just said it about my business, to make a business about that.
Fantastic, thank you. And I mean, it's interesting how you sort of decompartmentalize sort of professional and personal sort of experiences that you've had. So I was excited to hear that you actually grew up around the same stomping ground as me in Harrow. So yeah, shout out to everyone else from West London. Can you tell me or talk to me about life growing up in Britain and growing into who you are today?
Yeah, I never really thought about it for too long, Louisa. Like I just was born here. Like you go, I think I went through a series of events that made me think, well, actually, I'm not from here. And then this is like before, I guess, in my teens, early 20s, when people say, where are you really from? And I was like, I'm from Harrow, like just on the Met line. And where are you really from? But a series of things started to happen. So the earliest memory I've got of school is being sat in reception, I think it was in the reception, and they said, oh, is Asad here? And I was like, I don't know who that is, because until the age of 4/5, I was only interacting with my Indian family, and my name is pronounced Asad. So it was, oh, okay, that's a jar. And then I adopted Asad because it's easier to get by, and the soft U sound on 2 A's is a bit much to get by. And then I think as life went on, I started to think, I'm now in fields where I'm maybe not meant to be in. So I did a German and business degree. So the business degree makes sense, right? Asian, like stereotypically, people from Indian backgrounds will do law, dentistry, accounting, business. And I speak in broad brush stereotypes to make the point, not that I think they are a good thing. But I did German. So I lived in Germany for a year, and I realized that I was different. In Germany, I was an Asian person. People actually thought I was a Romani gypsy because of my skin tone. And that always stuck with me, of like being in different places and understanding different things. And I think crossing those two lines have always helped me to see things differently. And I think when it comes to something like research, that's quite important, because the othering that can happen around research can be really detrimental to the end effect of what you get. So I think who I am helped to shape that. And definitely, I remember, I think one of the points you asked me before, what led to doing what I do, I remember being in Westfield, looking around at all of the out of home, all of the advertising. And I was like, there's no one with different color skin on these adverts in 2014, 15. And I felt like something had to change. So yeah, I think just small series of things, but yeah, Harrow, stereotypical place to grow up, but it was fun.
Yeah, and I mean, what you talk about, the othering, is very relatable if you're a person of ethnic background in the UK. It's almost impossible to not have that sort of other experience. And I'm sure that there are a number of people who are listening to this that can relate. Which reminds me is that I would love to hear from everybody that's listening. If you do have any questions for Asad or myself, please drop them in our chat, and I will just go through them as and when. And during our conversation, it would be lovely to kind of hear from anybody, whether you're sharing your experiences or have any questions. So last year, 2020, crazy year for everybody, but in particular, George Floyd's death really sparked something, in certainly a lot of us, and it sparked the Black Lives Matter movement resurgence and made people more aware. Like there was just this sort of this awareness and clarity over systemic racism that didn't seem to exist in a way that it had done after this tragic incident. And I know that you're passionate about ensuring that we don't lose this momentum that's happening at this moment. And I would love to know how we maintain that momentum or even accelerate this momentum. Yeah, a lot of thoughts around that, but I'll leave that leave that at that for now.
Yeah, I think so. I think again, there's two ways to address that question. One is around personally, what can we do? And then the second is, what is the role of organizations within the change? So it'd be really easy to go into the personal bit, to go, well, read these, follow these people, do this, do that. And I don't need to necessarily tell people that unless people are crying out for it in the Q&A. There are a number of different resources to go and read. And I think that was a good part of last year, everyone feeling like they needed to do something and do some personal self-work in that and understand where they are. Personally, I looked a lot at what is the role of South Asian people within the Black Lives Matter movement. Where has there been certain levels of compliance within racism, particularly when people group together BAME? Because actually, if you look at the statistics, Indian men are high earners. So when you group BAME together and then you look at it through a socioeconomic lens, you can't have that grouping because it breaks down in other areas, for example, Bangladeshi men or Black women in broad context terms. So that's the personal bit. I think professionally, what organizations can do to maintain the movement and where we're going with it is actually to look at where the conversation sits inside companies. So for a very long time, D&I has sat within HR as a function. What that has meant is that has always felt like compliance, and it always has felt like if you get it wrong, you go to HR, and like people don't go to HR on good days, they go to HR on bad days. And so with that playing through, people were saying, well, actually diversity is very policy regulation driven, and that's important, and that's a really crucial factor to moving it. But it was always felt like a sense of we've got to survive, we've got to get our way through this.
Yeah.
Marketers, on the other hand, have been thinking about it from the point of view of, well, consumer expectations are changing and what people want to see in the world has changed. And actually what last year did was move that needle pretty hard, because all of a sudden more people were exposed to it. And so I think the conversation around diversity, inclusion, systematic racism, becoming anti-racist has to fit within the narrative of rebuilding businesses for the post-COVID world. It has to sit into the world of, well, if we're going to go into hybrid working, how is that going to be inclusive? So what does that mean for people who take on primary child care within households, which tends to fall on women? What does that mean for women of color who might have cultural expectations set upon them that require different needs? And how do therefore organizations become culturally confident to navigate their way through? Because it's the systems that are in place that have created where we are. And actually the exploration of those systems is really uncomfortable. And the challenge with some of that, and we run a podcast called The Speak Easier, where we have open conversations about this, because the space to have these conversations doesn't exist at the moment. We're stuck in our homes, we're communicating on social media, and we're caught in a culture war that's being fueled by the government and by the media, because we're seeing that whistleblowing and those dog whistles going off all the time. So what organizations need to do is sit back and say, well, actually, what is our role? What is our role for good? What are the values that we live by as an organization? Do we live by pure capitalist shareholder value that is monetary and financial? Or do we have a broader, like Unilever, set of measures that we look at that are about the environment, that are about the society, that are about the role that our business can play to change some of the systems, to challenge some of the history? So I think that exploration, and I think we'll continue to see that exploration for another probably year to year and a half. And then the findings of that will come through, and then we'll say, well, what are we prepared to do as a collective nation? What are we prepared to do as companies? And you see some companies like Green King saying, well, we're going to rename our pubs that have names such as Black Boy because we don't want to be a company that stands for that.
Yeah.
But then on the other end, you have Wetherspoons saying, we're not going to do that for the very same names. And
Yeah.
that's the culture war playing through. So I think it's maintaining that awareness and understanding of the systems, and then to accelerate it, saying, well, how are we going to change some of those, and how do we become agents for good or for change within that?
Absolutely. And, you know, I'd love to echo your point about creating a safe space to even have these conversations in the first place. That's something that, you know, we're certainly trying to do as an organization, and to understand some of these systems a little bit more. I think what's really been interesting for me to be able to explore, one of the things that I was a part of recently was series of interviews by photographer Miss Anne Harriman that came and spoke to a lot of different people in the organization, and it was really refreshing to actually just hear people candidly talk about their personal experiences and how it affects them in the office. And like you say, not just from a regulatory standpoint, which is how we've addressed D&I historically for so long. For us, I think one of this stuff, and for me really within the organization looking at D&I as well, one of the things that we've had to do is kind of take things back to basics. And part of that has actually been clarifying what the definition of diversity and inclusion is, and what it means to us, because sometimes we can assume that actually everybody's on the same page about those definitions. So Asad, what does diversity and inclusion mean to you? How would you define it, and what does it mean to you?
Yeah, a good question. I mean, the point just before that you made around stripping things back, like getting to first principles, I think every single business is having to do that at the moment, like especially in the hospitality trade, stripping it back and saying, well, what can we offer? What can we do? And I think that is what we need to be doing in the D&I conversation. So specifically, you know, I don't think I'm going to tell people anything that you might not be able to find online, because it's often talked about. What does diversity mean? What does inclusion mean? What does belonging mean? Diversity, by the root of the word, has got DI in it, difference, and so it's all the different characteristics that come together and create difference within an organization. And those differences are often leaning on protected characteristics that are defined by the Equality Act. So those are anything that you shouldn't be discriminated against within your organization, whether it's age, whether it's gender, whether it's sexuality, race and ethnicity. That's pure play diversity. And I think we are now at a place where everyone understands that difference equals good. Different ways of thinking, different schools of thought, all good. The inclusion bit is, how do you get that all to work together? And how do you make sure that all of these different characteristics feel like they're included in the conversation and are a part of the progress? And the word that comes through with that is belonging. So how do you make sure that people belong? And how I'm seeing that play out right now in the conversations that I'm having is people saying, we want to be more diverse. We want to reach diverse audiences. And it's actually pausing to say, what do you mean by that? Because the default for some people is diverse equals, and I'm saying in the mainstream media narrative, diverse equals not male, not white. But actually, to be a white man does categorize you within a diverse community, because that is something in. It's actually the mix of that in the inclusion, and what weight is being given to certain groups, and therefore how is that collectively working together. And if you look throughout the organization from top to bottom, is it inclusive at every single level, and does everyone work their way through, or are there blockers and things that change the way that people move through?
Yes.
So I think it's really important that there is a distinction between the two, and that just hiring for diversity, lots of people hire for diversity, and those are the sorts of briefs that are flying around at the moment. That doesn't work on its own, because you have to state what type of diversity are we specifically looking for, because it will mean different factors for different structures, back to your point, that need to be changed. But also, once we've got those people in, are they going to stick around? Because if it's not inclusive, they're going to go.
Yeah.
And if they don't feel like they belong, then they're going to go as well. So there's a lot of unpicking, but those are the broad definitions of those two words.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's so much nuance in people. And when you're thinking about diversity, sometimes we really underestimate just how much diversity is within diversity. And I've certainly been in situations in the past where I've been asked about diversity and I'm like, I don't know, I'm just a Black woman. I can only speak from a very specific segment of a very large and broad pool of people. So that's absolutely right. So and just before I ask you your next question, I'd love to take some questions from people. If they have any, please put them in the chat box. So for many in business, success is being able to grow and do more of what you're doing. I would love to know what success looks like for you and for the Unmistakables and the Unmistakables team.
Mm-hmm. Success implies that there's an end goal, and it's like once we reach this, it will be job done. Mm-hmm. Now, if I reach that in my lifetime, I will be baffled, because what's going on in the world is hundreds and hundreds of years of structures being re-examined and revisited and rethought about. So success for me, I would hope one day, is that we don't need to exist, and that some of the thinking that we put out into the world around inside out inclusion and how to put in personal checks and barriers have become commonplace, which we're starting to see happen. But I think real success one day would look like the fact that actually we won't be having this conversation. But I don't know if that's going to be the case. It feels like this is a constant move through, and that when you read about the empire, when you read about the history of certain countries, you just see that this is a constant cycle that we go through. So as much, Louisa, as I'd like to say, I'd love to be extinct, I just think the way that people move, and I think there's some questions coming through around that we could explore, that show that the conversation keeps moving and the language keeps moving and the way that we as humans work keeps changing.
Yeah. And just as I wait for some questions to come in, I mean it in the nicest possible way, that in an ideal world, I wish your company didn't have to exist even. As much as Louisa. I wish you all the success in the world. So I think but I completely understand, and I think that's quite a powerful statement in and of itself. So Asad, what's the
well, I just Louisa, on that, I can see, I think in the Q&A box there's a question from May around do you think it's the Western idea of beauty which influences the way that an individual BAME person is accepted or targeted with prejudice? I think May says, I've not ever, since 1963, ever been targeted with racial abuse or prejudice. Instead, I know it is the way I looked that drew people to me. After spending decades in market research, being the only non-white researcher, and about 4 decades later, there are a few more now. But May was never made to feel inferior, except once when their boss was talking to the client to accept me to run a project. And that was 1982. And I think like May makes a really interesting point there about like just coining the term BAME, because it often gets put into, well, Black and Asian, and that's it. But there's so many in that, and the non-majority group face really different issues within that, and a lot of that is built on history, is built on stereotypes, is built on the portrayals that media put out that market researchers can influence in some way. But I guess I'm not sure if I'm directly answering that, but I do think the Western ideals of things of beauty does shape a lot. I know definitely from an Asian standpoint, that Asian hair is seen very different to others, and often the examples that we see in advertising skew Western, because that's where the bulk of capitalism is pushed out from. So I think May has a really good point there about where our standards and ideals come from, and how we need to take what we call less of an ethnocentric view of things to pull ourselves out of a Western leaning and look at things differently.
Great, thank you. And I've just seen a question here from Kimberly. So as a small agency, 10 to 15 people, what is the best way to go about ensuring that at the level of recruitment, you are recruiting a diverse workforce?
So within recruitment, there's a few different things you can do. One is around setting some principles. So what are the principles for which by which you hire, and linking those principles back to your company values. So thinking through, do you do anonymized CVs, for example, to make sure that there's no gender skews or name bias playing out when you review CVs and applications, all the way through to looking at positive action. So thinking about, well, how can we make sure that our job applications are being seen in different places, are being thought about by different people. So like the structural kind of strategy piece around principles takes a bit longer because it requires a bit of discussion, especially even between 10 to 15 people. What does that stand for?
Yeah.
But then the tactical stuff of practically looking in different places. Also thinking about, there's really good tools out there like Textio, where you can run your job adverts through an algorithm that tells you whether there's bias sitting in it, predominantly towards gender at the moment. But those small things actually ladder up to quite big things to make sure that your company is being perceived to be more inclusive. There was just, for example, you'll need to stop me, Louisa, at some point, but there was just a story this morning, and I appreciate this is a bigger level, but there was a story about how senior executive searches show bias against women. They analysed job adverts and they found that they consistently use less inclusive language because it's skewed more towards male attributes. So just such a small thing can lead to such a big thing. Yeah. In how people perceive your company. So I hope that helps.
I've heard of Textio, so that's really interesting. I'll look that up, and I'd love something for that to go stretch far and wide, even beyond gender discrimination. Right, so in the interest of time, I just wanted to ask Asad, what's the best way for us to keep up to date with the work that you're doing at the Unmistakables?
How do people sort it? A couple of things. So the unmistakables.com is our website where we keep things up to date, or we're actually looking for qual researchers at the moment. So if there's anyone out there thinking they sound interesting, we'd love to know what they do. Then you can email info@theunmistakables.com. There's no E in the middle. Or if you just Google my name, you'll all roads lead here somehow, just through Google. So yeah, it's you can find us through various ways.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for speaking with us today. It's been an absolute pleasure, Asad.
No worries, Louisa. I've just noticed there's another question from Emily Hayes. I don't know if we want to try and slip that one in.
I didn't see that.
So yeah, what's your viewpoint on stereotypes in terms of representation? Can they ever be viewed as positive? Yeah, Emily, it's totally complex. So I think when it comes to stereotypes, it's about examining where they come from and what the root is of them. And the best example I've been given, Emily, is that for decades, advertising has built the world into an ideal that we'd like to get to. So if you talk to planners, they'll tell you, well, we need to be building this ideal, and then that's how we're going to sell, because people want to buy into the dream of what we're selling. Mm-hmm. That shift has really been undermined through the way that we now consume media, the fact that advertising, at least above the line television advertising, where a bulk of spend has been undermined. And the stereotypes that were playing out in there were quite harmful after a time, because the people who were developing that were leaning on their own cultural references to perpetuate those. So I think, can they ever be viewed as positive? I think when we look back, we can say actually it's positive to have seen some of those stereotypes to understand what not to do. But when it's now about moving forward, the only time that a stereotype can be positive is actually when we learn from that's not the way, because the stereotypes that play out can be quite damaging. They play out in the LGBT community all the time, that gay men are seen in a certain way, lesbian women are seen in a certain way. They're not helpful because they take away all the nuance of what someone is, and they put people into a really specific box. So I totally agree with Emily that it's complex, but my personal view is stereotypes in and of themselves tend to do more harm than good.
Yeah, that's a great answer. So better as a throwback than
than a throw forward. Yeah, that's nice.
Thank you so much for that question, Emily. That was a good one. Okay, I think we've come to the end. Yeah, so thank you so much, Asad.
Thanks, Louisa. It's been lovely talking to you.
Yeah, my pleasure. I mean, we could go on so many things I'd love to unpack, but this has been a really good session.
Yep. I'd also like to say a massive thank you to both of you from the AQR. You know, this webinar series is crucial for us as researchers to actually make the work that we do better and make sure that what happens as an end result in advertising other places is actually going to be, you know, better and more inclusive, to get my terminology right. Asad's website is there in the chat. Do check him out. Do check out the podcast series, the Speak Easier. It is a brilliant series as well. So I know we live in a virtual world, but I still think everyone should do a round of applause. So wherever you are at home, please give a massive round of applause to our two speakers. Thank you very much, and have a good day wherever you might be. Thank you.
Thank you, Ollie. Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.